CIA agents are trained to prepare for the worst: capture, persecution, failure. They are taught to make their escape in such a way that their route cannot be retraced. Jim Thompson underwent this training. On March 26, 1967, he set out on an afternoon walk in the Malaysian mountains and vanished without a trace. 500 people combed the jungle for 11 days. They found nothing. What was it? A perfect escape planned by a master? Or something far more sinister? It happened on 26th of March, 1967, in the Malaysian highlands of the Cameron Highlands. More than 50 years have passed since then. Jim Thompson was never found. A few years before his disappearance, Jim Thompson was perhaps the most famous American in Southeast Asia. He was 61 years old. He wore suits made of Thai silk, smoked, and was never without good company. Yet he gave the impression of a man who knew far more than he let on. In some circles, he was known as the Silk King. In others, he was simply remembered as a former intelligence officer. James Harrison Wilson Thompson was born in 1906 in Greenville, Delaware, into a family of distinction. His grandfather had been a Union general during the Civil War. He attended St. Paul's boarding school, then Princeton, graduating in 1928. That same year, he competed in the Olympic Games in sailing. He then enrolled in the architecture faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, but did not complete the course. He failed mathematical analysis. He worked as an architect in New York for several years. Then the war broke out. Thompson joined the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the American Military Intelligence Agency that would later become the CIA. He served in North Africa, in Europe, and then in Ceylon. Toward the very end of the war, he was sent to Thailand to organize the local resistance in case the Japanese forces put up a fight. The war ended before this task was fully required. But Thompson did not leave Bangkok. In post-war Bangkok, he saw something that most foreigners overlooked: Thai weavers at wooden looms, producing silk with a dense, heavy texture and a color that shifted from amber to copper, and from aquamarine to deep blue, depending on the light. The industry was in decline. Most traders considered it unprofitable. Thompson thought otherwise. In 1948, he founded the Thai Silk Company. A few years later, his silk made its way to Broadway, in the costumes for the musical The King and I. Then it appeared in the pages of Vogue, then in the collections of haute couture houses. What was destined to disappear became a global phenomenon. In Bangkok, Thompson assembled several old Thai teak houses, joined them together to form a single residential complex overlooking the Sansep Canal, and filled the rooms with antiques: Ming Dynasty porcelain, Buddhist sculptures, and shimmering silks. He was a regular guest at diplomatic dinners. The international press wrote about him. He led a life that others could only imagine, yet remained a man whose past defied simple retelling. In his work, he was tough, according to some of his contemporaries, almost ruthless. In his private life, he was reserved. He never spoke of his past in intelligence. He scarcely mentioned his marriage, which had ended in divorce. Instead, he was known as a man who loved to roam rough terrain without a route or a destination, venturing where no paths led, and returning when he chose to. In late March 1967, Thompson agreed to spend a few days in Cameron Highlands. This is a mountain resort in central Malaysia, situated at an altitude of around 1,500 meters above sea level. British colonial officials had developed it back in the 1930s. Tudor-style cottages, manicured lawns, golf courses. The cool mountain air was considered an antidote to the tropical heat of the lowlands. Tea plantations cascaded down the slopes and terraces, and beyond them lay the jungle. Dense, steep, with waist-high undergrowth that blocked the view, beyond a few paces. Thompson did not arrive alone. His old acquaintance, Constance Mongskow, whom everyone called Connie, had flown with him from Bangkok to Penang on March 23rd, and from there they had taken a taxi to Cameron Highlands. They stayed with Dr. Lin Tiangi, a Singaporean chemist, and his wife Helen. The cottage was called Moonlight Bungalow and stood on a hill right at the edge of the trees. A single access road led to it. The day after their arrival, Thompson and Dr. Lin set off along a new trail. Lin twisted his ankle. Thompson led them back, using the stream bed to guide them. At one point, he briefly lost his way, but this did not seem to bother him in the slightest. He enjoyed such detours. The 26th of March was a Sunday. It was Easter. In the morning, the whole group went to a service at All Souls Church. Afterwards, they returned to the cottage and had lunch. At around 11 before lunch, Thompson stopped briefly by the Lutheran Mission bungalow and exchanged a few words with the driver of a white car parked at the side of the road. He then returned to his group. After lunch, that peaceful late afternoon calm that characterizes Sundays at a holiday resort set in. The mountain air was cool and slightly damp. A light breeze blew in from the plantations, carrying the scent of earth and leaves. Thompson stepped out onto the veranda. The sound of an aluminium deck chair scraping across the wooden decking could be heard. Then the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path leading to the road. A few seconds, and silence. According to one account, he waved goodbye to Helen Lin and Connie Mongskow at around 1:30. According to another, the sound of a deck chair being moved could be heard closer to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The exact time has remained a matter of dispute, but in both cases he was wearing a light tie silk suit, no flask, no knife, a jacket, a packet of cigarettes, and a lighter were left on the veranda. In the room, on the bedside table, were his passport, wallet, driving license, and a small tin box containing tablets for gallstones. At around 4 o'clock, a cook from the Lutheran Mission spotted a tall foreigner walking along the road. A cook named Fatima, who lived 300 yards from Moonlight Bungalow, saw him pass by her window. An unidentified woman, who gave evidence later, saw him sitting on a large rock by the roadside, smoking and looking tired. Then he got up and walked on. No one has seen him since. Thompson hadn't returned by dinner time. Dr. Lin waited a while, then decided he might have been held up at the golf club, so he drove there. Thompson wasn't there. Lin returned to the cottage and started phoning his acquaintances. When it got dark, he contacted the police. Cameron Highlands grows dark quickly. At this altitude, the mist begins to descend while it is still light, rising to waist height and obscuring first the undergrowth, then the lower branches of the trees. By the time Dr. Lin hung up the phone, the jungle behind the cottage had already become a solid wall of darkness. No one knew which way he had gone. Dr. Lin called the police when it was already too dark to see anything outside. The officer on duty took the report. The first officers arrived at Moonlight Bungalow that very night, but it was impossible to search the jungle thoroughly in the dark. Yonder, the torches illuminated only the nearest 2 meters of undergrowth. Beyond that lay a dense, impenetrable darkness in which even sounds were lost. On the morning of 27th of March, the first search parties gathered at the cottage. They brought in the bloodhounds. The dogs were led up to the veranda, allowed to sniff Thompson's belongings, and they picked up the scent straight away, down the gravel path, towards the driveway, and onto the tarmac. There the trail went cold. The handlers led the dogs in circles, checked the verges, and tried heading towards the jungle. Nothing. The police came to a conclusion that seemed logical. He had got into a car. But no one knew who had seen the car, what it looked like, or where it had gone. The direction in which Thompson had gone remained unknown What unfolded over the next few days became the largest ground search operation in the history of Southeast Asia at that time. The search was joined by the Malaysian police, army units, British military units stationed in the region, and Gurkha soldiers, Nepalese soldiers in British service, renowned for their ability to operate in mountainous and forested terrain. From deep within the highlands came Orang Asli trackers, representatives of the peninsula's indigenous peoples, who had lived and hunted in these jungles for generations. They were joined by tourists who happened to be in the Cameron Highlands, local residents, Boy Scouts, and, according to some reports, even patients from the local hospital who were able to move about unaided. Helicopters took to the air. In the end, more than 500 people were involved in the search at any one time. They combed through 17.5 square miles of jungle, an area that had been divided into squares and covered in lines, taking care not to miss a single patch. Some groups worked on the paths, whilst others worked in the thicket between the paths, where the undergrowth reached waist height and higher. The Cameron Highlands jungle is nothing like the open tropical forests you see in documentaries. Here the trees form a continuous canopy through which enough light filters to allow thick undergrowth to thrive on the forest floor. Visibility is limited to a few paces. The voices of the search parties carried through the thicket muffled, almost indistinguishable. A person could have been lying 5 meters from the search line and still not been seen. One search and rescue expert who studied the case decades later calculated that under such conditions, the probability of finding a body was no more than 43%. He also established that the actual coverage of the search area was insufficient. Instead of 17 square miles, at least 70 should have been searched. This meant that even if the search yielded no results, it could not be considered exhaustive. The jungle had not been searched. It was simply too vast. The difficulties were compounded by the fact that, from the outset, no one knew which direction to search in. Thompson had not declared a route. No one had seen exactly where he had turned off the access road. Search areas were mapped out based on guesswork. Most likely that way, probably no further. Every square on the headquarters map represented a day's work for someone in the undergrowth, with a machete and a radio, in the cool mountain air that turned cold and damp by evening. By 4 o'clock, the mist had dropped to waist height, and the teams walked on, seeing only the feet of those walking beside them. On the third day of the search, other people arrived at the cottage. They were neither police nor soldiers. By that time, the international press had reported on Thompson's disappearance, and this had attracted the attention of a different sort of people. In total, over 180 mystics, clairvoyants, and psychics had gathered at the scene during the search. Some set off firecrackers along the jungle paths. It was believed that the loud noise could drive away the evil spirits that might be holding Thompson captive. Others meditated on the cottage veranda or pointed in various directions on the horizon, calling out the directions. The firecracker explosions could be heard from afar, sharp pops in the mountain air, the echoes of which faded into the thicket and did not return. Among those who arrived was Peter Hurkos, a Dutch psychic whose name was well known on both sides of the Atlantic at the time. He had worked with several American police departments and given interviews to major publications. Hurkos arrived in Cameron Highlands, inspected the cottage, examined Thompson's belongings, and made a statement. According to him, Thompson was alive. He had been abducted and taken abroad, but not for ransom. Hurkos said he would stake his life on it. No redemption requests were received during the entire search. On the 4th day, then the 5th, then the 6th, the situation remained unchanged. Search parties returned in the evening with nothing to show for their efforts. Helicopters flew over the highlands and saw nothing but an endless expanse of green. The Orang Asli trackers, who knew these parts better than anyone, found no traces. Gradually, details that had initially remained obscure began to come to light. The first question concerned the time. When exactly did Thompson leave the cottage? One source claimed that he waved goodbye to Helen Lynn and Connie Mongskow at around 1:30. Another said that the deck chair on the veranda had been moved closer to 3 o'clock, a difference of more than an hour. It was of fundamental importance for understanding the route. If he left at 1:30 by 4 o'clock, when witnesses saw him, he could have covered a considerable distance. If he left at 3, the chain of witness statements looked different. None of those present at the cottage could give a definite answer. A Sunday afternoon in Cameron Highlands was not a time for watching the clock. The second clue was a convoy of cars. It transpired that on the day of his disappearance, a convoy of 5 cars had traveled along the access road to the Highlands. They had driven up into the mountains in the early afternoon and come back down about 3 hours later, just around the time Thompson failed to turn up for dinner. It was not possible to establish who these people were, where they were going, or whether they had seen anything on the road. The road to Cameron Highlands was a standard tourist route, but none of the investigators mentioned the 5 cars that had traveled there and back at precisely that time. The third clue was a bank account. Shortly before his trip, there were about $50 left in Thompson's account. For a man of his means, this was a sum that could not be accounted for by ordinary expenses and did not fit the usual pattern. The inconsistencies had been quietly piling up, without yet adding up to any particular explanation. Among the discoveries, the most significant was what they hadn't found. On the veranda of the Moonlight bungalow lay a jacket, a packet of cigarettes, and a lighter. In the room, on the bedside table, were a passport, a wallet containing documents, and a tin of tablets that Thompson was supposed to take for his gallstone attacks. The investigators spent a long time examining this collection of items from every angle. A heavy smoker who had left his cigarettes behind suggested a man who expected to return in a few minutes. The passport, money, and driving license suggested a man who was planning neither an escape nor a prolonged absence. The pills suggested a man who had either absent-mindedly forgotten them or had not been thinking of anything untoward at all. 3 witnesses saw Thompson alive during the afternoon of March 26th. A cook at the Lutheran mission spotted a tall foreigner at around 4 o'clock. He was walking along the road away from the cottage. Fatima, a cook who lived 300 yards from Moonlight, saw him pass by her window. Later, when she was shown a photograph, she identified him without hesitation. A third witness, an unidentified woman who gave evidence much later, saw him sitting on a large rock by the roadside. He looked tired and was holding a cigarette. It was precisely this last piece of evidence that raised questions. If he had left the cottage without any cigarettes, where had the cigarette by the stone come from? Had someone offered him a cigarette? Or had he taken cigarettes with him, leaving a spare packet on the bedside table? Or had the woman mistaken him for someone else? None of the investigators provided a clear answer to this question. Alongside the search in the jungle, the press launched its own investigation. Theories emerged one after another. An attack by a tiger or leopard, a fall into a camouflage pit containing stakes set by the Orang Asli to trap wild animals, a kidnapping for ransom, or a political assassination. Journalists counted around 25 plausible explanations. In those years, the question of Thompson's past and intelligence was raised cautiously, yet inevitably. The year 1967 was the height of the Vietnam War. Southeast Asia was a region where several intelligence services operated simultaneously, overlapping and monitoring one another. Thailand, Malaysia, and Cambodia were not merely neighboring countries, but points on a map that many agencies interpreted in their own way. A man with Thompson's background, who had lived in Bangkok for over 20 years and hosted diplomats, Military personnel and officials from various countries inevitably became part of that landscape, whether he wanted to or not. The official line was that Thompson had long since retired from intelligence work and was now solely involved in business. But those who knew him personally found this explanation hard to believe. He was far too cautious. He was far too skilled at keeping quiet about things he didn't want to talk about. Gradually, reports began to surface in the press suggesting that the trip to Cameron Highlands had not, in fact, been merely a holiday. According to one account, Thompson had traveled there with a specific aim: to make contact with Priti Panomyong, the former Prime Minister of Thailand, who was living in exile. According to another, parallel version, he was seeking meetings with people linked to the Malayan Communist Party, which was active in the region with arms in hand. A Malayan underground movement in the mountainous regions did indeed exist. It was entirely conceivable that a man with Thompson's past might have had overlapping interests. No evidence to support these versions emerged in the investigation materials, nor, however, was there any to refute them. On the 5th of June 1967, just over 2 months after his disappearance in Malaysia, Thompson's mother died in Bangkok. She never found out what had happened to her son, but that was only the first in a series of events to follow. On August 30th of that year, Thompson's sister, Catherine Thompson Wood, was found dead at her home in Pennsylvania. She had been beaten to death. Nothing was missing from the house. 2 guard dogs named Mr. Magoo and Rampus did not react to what was happening, which, again, says, according to investigators, suggested that the killer was someone she knew. Catherine's son, Jim's nephew, came under suspicion. 4 years later, he took his own life without ever having been formally charged. The investigation never established a direct link between Catherine's murder and Jim's disappearance. Yet the fact that, within the space of a single year, one member of the Thompson family vanished without trace and another was murdered was consistently highlighted in media reports. 2 people, in a single year, with no explanation. A coincidence of this magnitude demands either acceptance or an explanation. The investigation offered neither. On April 4th, 1967, the active phase of the search operation was officially wound up. The equipment was removed. Most of those who had arrived had left. The search camps were dismantled, and the jungle closed in once more over the paths that people had cut through it for almost 2 weeks. On 23rd of April, British officer Richard Noon undertook a further 36-hour search. He found nothing. Local efforts continued for several more months, gradually petering out. In 1974, 7 years after his disappearance, a Thai court officially declared Jim Thompson dead. This was a legal formality required for his estate to pass to his heirs. Legal death without a body, without a location, without circumstances. Henry B. Thompson's nephew inherited the house in Bangkok, along with the entire collection, and donated them to the foundation. The house was open to the public. The Thai Silk Company continued to operate. The case had not, however, been officially closed. It had become a cold case, technically open, but effectively dormant. The Malaysian police had never officially announced the closure of the investigation. This meant that, formally, it was still ongoing, but no active investigative work was being carried out. No new witnesses were being sought, and no new lines of inquiry were being pursued. The case existed in a state that lawyers refer to as pending, unsolved, not closed, and dormant. But in 1985, 18 years later, something else happened in the Cameron Highlands. Residents of the Orang Asli community, who were working in a vegetable garden in the Brinchang area, discovered bone fragments in the ground. There was no skull. They were found in an unmarked grave at the edge of the cultivated plot. The police arrived, collected the remains, and took them to the district medical office in Tanah Rata. No one ever checked who the bones belonged to. In those days, DNA analysis wasn't a routine procedure, and the bones simply lay in a box in an office cupboard, waiting for someone to get round to them. Then the medical practice moved to a new building. During the move, the box went missing. It remains unclear what these bones were and to whom they belonged. No missing person from the area has been officially linked to these remains. Even if they had belonged to Thompson, the only physical evidence that could have confirmed anything was lost when the district office moved. In 2015, the American search and rescue expert Lou Tolman, who had been investigating the case for several years, proposed conducting a new search in the Highlands, using specially trained dogs to detect human remains and modern forensic techniques. The Malaysian authorities have not officially responded to this proposal. No further organized searches were ever carried out in the Cameron Highlands. Once the search camps had been dismantled and the jungle had returned to being just a jungle, one question remained, unresolved. What happened to Jim Thompson on March 26, 1967, between 4 p.m., when he was last seen alive by the roadside, and nightfall? Over the past decades, this case has given rise to a host of theories. Some of them fell within the scope of a routine police investigation. Others went far beyond that. Each theory was based on some element of truth, and each had its own flaw, which meant it could not be considered definitive. The version regarding an accident remained the first and official one. Thompson set off on a walk with no route, no equipment, and no water. He had already got lost in these jungles the day before he went missing, whilst leading a group along a stream. The Cameron Highlands jungle disorients you quickly. The terrain is rugged. The paths branch off in all directions without signposts, and anyone who strays slightly from the path can lose their bearings within minutes. Moreover, Thompson suffered from a chronic gallbladder condition. The tablets he was supposed to take regularly were left on the bedside table. An attack of gallstones in the jungle, far from the trail, could have incapacitated him quickly. The arguments in favor of this theory are compelling. Expert Lou Tolman, who examined the case from a forensic perspective, calculated that, given the density of the undergrowth in the Cameron Highlands, the probability of discovering the body during the search was no more than 43%. This means that the body could have been lying within the search area, and search parties would have passed within a few meters without seeing it. Toolman also pointed out that the area actually searched was 4 times smaller than necessary. There is evidence to contradict this version of events. Thompson had undergone survival training. He knew the jungle well and was skilled at navigating by water and terrain. He was in good physical shape for a man of 61, and he went precisely where the paths did not lead. It was his habit, not a coincidence. A trained scout who got lost in the jungle during an afternoon walk. This explanation is not impossible, but it is far-fetched. Another aspect of this theory concerns vultures. In the tropical jungle, a body does not remain unnoticed for long. Birds of prey and scavengers react quickly. Search teams specifically monitored the movement of the birds in the sky above the jungle, hoping to pinpoint the location by observing circling vultures. For 11 days, nothing was spotted over the search area. The second version concerned the trap. The Orang Asli, the indigenous people of the peninsula, traditionally dug pits in the jungle lined with sharpened stakes for hunting wild animals. A stranger who strayed from the path might not have noticed such a trap and could have fallen into it. According to this theory, the indigenous people, having discovered the foreigner's body, might have secretly buried it, fearing persecution by the authorities. This would explain the absence of the body during the extensive search. This remained a theoretical possibility. None of the Orang Asli who took part in the search reported anything of the sort. The indigenous trackers, who knew the area well, did not point to a single spot that could have been the site of such a burial. There was no direct evidence. The third version involved a white car on the road, The dogs lost the trail precisely where the tarmac began. This could only mean one thing. Thompson had got into a car. Whether voluntarily or not is another matter. Investigator Philip Rivers put forward the theory of a road traffic accident. Thompson might have been hit by a car, the driver of which, panicking, hid the body. Perhaps it was that very white car, driven by the man Thompson had spoken to earlier that morning around 11 o'clock near the Lutheran Mission bungalow. The white car was mentioned twice in the case. Once in the morning as a known fact, and later in connection with the theory that a convoy of 5 cars had passed along the road in the afternoon. The investigation failed to establish any link between these two mentions. The driver of the white car was never officially identified. The fourth theory is that it was a political assassination. It was explored in detail by the Australian documentary filmmaker Barry Broman in his film, released in 2017. According to this account, the trip to the Cameron Highlands was not a holiday. Thompson traveled there to meet with Priti Panomyong, the former Prime Minister of Thailand, who was in exile. According to another account of the same version, he was seeking a way to contact the leader of the Communist Party of Malaya, Chin Pen, who was operating in that very region. Broman relied on the testimony of several witnesses, including a certain Theo Pin and Willis Bird Jr., who, based on accounts from third parties, relayed what they described as the deathbed confessions of local CPM commanders. Thompson was allegedly identified as a CIA agent, detained, and executed. The story was falling apart from within. One of Broman's sources claimed that the execution took place right in the Cameron Highlands. Another of Broman's sources, quoting Willis Bird Jr., insisted that Thompson had been abducted alive, transported by boat 500 miles to Cambodia or China, and had died there. These two versions contradicted one another and were based solely on secondhand accounts without a single piece of documentary evidence. The film's director put it bluntly. In an interview in 1917, he said, "They'll never find Jim. He was murdered." That was his personal view, not the conclusion of an investigation. The fifth version is a voluntary escape. It was developed, in particular, by the journalist and researcher Richard Hughes, who knew Thompson personally. Hughes insisted that Thompson had disappeared of his own accord. Perhaps his life in Bangkok had reached a certain point beyond which he preferred to start afresh, in a different place, under a different name. Hughes later wrote about this. "I still maintain that he disappeared of his own free will and choice, and not under duress." There have been reports that Thompson was spotted in Tahiti, in Europe, and in various Asian countries. None of these reports have been confirmed. The argument against the escape theory is what is generally considered the strongest evidence in this case. The items left behind: a passport, a wallet, documents, pills, cigarettes. Someone planning to vanish might have left their documents behind. The CIA is capable of producing new ones. But one does not leave gallbladder pills behind without a reason. Attacks of gallstone disease are painful and can be dangerous. To disappear into thin air without the medication he needed regularly would have meant either extreme recklessness or something that happened suddenly. There is another argument against fleeing that is rarely mentioned. Thompson had built a life in Bangkok to which he had devoted 20 years, a silk company, an antique shop, a social circle, a reputation. People give all that up for various reasons, but usually leave at least some indication of their intention. In neither his letters, nor his conversations, nor his actions in the months leading up to his disappearance, did any of his close friends or family find anything that would suggest a desire to leave. The sixth theory: elimination by the U.S. intelligence services. Several motives were cited. Thompson allegedly knew too much about the CIA's activities in the region, or had taken an inconvenient stance on the Vietnam War, or for some other reason had become a liability to the people who had once trained and guided him. In 1967, the Vietnam War was in full swing, and the American presence in Southeast Asia operated on several levels that rarely intersected in public. Thompson had been living in Bangkok since 1945. During that time, he had seen a great deal. Who he knew and what he knew. No one but himself ever spoke of it. This theory had no documentary evidence to support it. It was based solely on logic. A man with such a past who vanished without a trace in a politically unstable region at the height of the Cold War. This combination naturally gives rise to such theories. No source with links to the U.S. intelligence services has ever publicly commented on this case, neither confirming nor denying it. If one considers all 6 versions simultaneously, a common feature becomes apparent. Each explains one part of the picture, but fails to explain another. The accident explains the absence of a body, but does not explain how a man with intelligence training could have died whilst out for a walk. Political assassination explains the complete lack of traces, but relies on testimony that contradicts itself. Escape explains the disappearance without a trace, but does not explain the medicines left behind. A road traffic accident explains the trail breaking off on the road, but does not explain where the body disappeared to in a holiday resort with large numbers of people. There is another aspect that all the theories overlook. Thompson was a man who had undergone special training specifically for situations where no traces could be left behind. If something happened involving him, whether voluntarily or against his will, then a man of his caliber would either have ensured that no traces remained, or would have found himself in the hands of people who knew how to do so. In either case, the absence of evidence ceases to be an anomaly and becomes the norm. No single version provides a definitive answer. This is precisely the situation in which the Thompson case has remained for over 50 years. Whilst the investigation was working with the information it had, something else was happening outside Malaysia. Thompson's name has not disappeared from the headlines. First it was the press, then books. William Warren, an American journalist based in Bangkok, wrote several books about Thompson, including The Legendary American and The Unsolved Mystery of Jim Thompson. These books became the primary sources for everyone who subsequently investigated the case. Warren knew Thompson personally and gathered first-hand material whilst witnesses were still alive and their memories had not yet faded. Then other researchers emerged. Then came the documentaries. In 2017, Barry Broman released the feature-length documentary, Who Killed Jim Thompson?, which focused on the theory of a political assassination and was released to mark the 50th anniversary of his disappearance. The film drew a new generation of viewers to the case and reignited public debate, which by that point had died down somewhat. The Thompson case has become one of those stories that periodically resurface of their own accord. Whenever a new person decides to get to the bottom of it, there are forums and discussion threads on the internet that have been running for decades. Among the participants are tourists who have visited the Cameron Highlands, fans of crime mysteries, former residents of the region, and journalists. None of them has brought anything new to the table, but the case has lived on. In 2015, the American search and rescue expert Lou Tolman published a detailed analytical report on the case. Tolman applied modern methods of evaluating search operations and concluded that the initial search in 1967 was significantly limited in terms of both the area covered and the methodology used. He proposed conducting a new search using specially trained dogs to detect human remains and Matson's anonymous reporting system, which allows information to be gathered from local residents anonymously. The Malaysian authorities did not officially respond to this proposal. No further searches took place. In Bangkok, his house still stands overlooking the Sen Sep Canal. Thai Silk Company, founded by Thompson in 1948, has grown into an international luxury brand with shops in dozens of countries. The company's logo still features a stylized silhouette of Thompson. His name appears on the products. The silk that he once set out to save from extinction has become one of the most recognizable Thai brands in the world. The house in Bangkok is open to the public and ranks among the city's most visited museums. Several traditional Thai teak houses, which Thompson collected and assembled into a single complex, stand just as they did in his lifetime. Teak floors, Italian marble, antique chandeliers, and Ming Dynasty porcelain displayed on shelves and in display cabinets. These rooms are visited daily by tourists who had never heard of Thompson before buying a ticket, and by those who came to Bangkok specifically to see it. In one of the rooms, there's a photograph of him hanging on the wall, a burly man in a white shirt, holding a cigarette, smiling at the camera. The photograph was taken shortly before March 1967. In the Cameron Highlands, the Moonlight Bungalow still stands. It is the very same Tudor-style house, with the same gravel path leading from the veranda to the driveway. Tourists sometimes make a special trip there to see the place where it all began, or, more accurately, where it all ended. Some of them take photos of the veranda, the path, the edge of the jungle. Then they post the pictures with captions about the mysterious disappearance that has never been solved. The road where the dogs lost the trail looks like any ordinary mountain road. Tarmac, a verge, and the jungle beyond. Nothing here suggests that anything happened at this very spot. In the evenings, the mist descends just as it did in March '67. The birds cry out just the same. The undergrowth on either side of the road is just as dense as it was back then. The paths that 500 people cleared in April of 1967 have long since become overgrown. Where he went from there is unknown. It is not known whether he got anywhere. What happened to the man who was taught to vanish when he actually did vanish? The official case remains open. It offers no answer. 58 years after his disappearance, he is still listed as missing, subject to a court ruling declaring him dead, issued in the absence of a body, a location, or circumstances, and without a single piece of evidence that has stood the test of time. Emanuela in heaven. That was exactly what the Pope replied to a man who had been searching for his missing sister for 30 years. Emanuele Orlandi was just 15. She was a citizen of the world's most secretive state, the Vatican. The girl sang in the church choir and one day simply did not come home. For 42 years, the Holy See swore it knew nothing about her. For 42 years, they insisted, no secret archives exist. But in 2024, the Vatican prosecutor officially acknowledged, there is a file on Emanuela. It has been found, and it is strictly classified. Why did the girl's kidnappers ring the Vatican Secretary of State directly, rather than the police? And what secret has the Holy See been keeping for almost half a century? The Vatican is a state covering an area of less than half a square kilometer, with its own army, its own laws, its own currency, and its own citizens. There are several hundred of them, cardinals, clergy, Swiss guards, and a small number of lay staff who, by virtue of their duties, are permitted to live on the territory of the Holy See together with their families. Ercole Orlandi was one such employee. He worked in the prefecture of the papal household, dealing with administrative matters, and this entitled his family to an apartment within the Vatican walls. His daughter Emanuela grew up in a place where ordinary Roman children usually only visit on school trips. The Vatican gardens, which she had walked through since childhood, are closed to the public. For her, St. Peter's Square was not a tourist attraction, but a courtyard, just a few minutes' walk away. She sang in the choir of the church of Santa Anna dei Palafrenieri, a small Baroque church by the Vatican gates, attended mainly by those who live and work there. In the evenings, she would go to flute lessons at the Institute of Sacred Music, an educational institution attached to the Holy See, which trained musicians for church services. Emanuela's was the fourth of 5 children in her family. She wore glasses, which she really hated putting on, and because of this, she often squinted in bright light. Her mother once sewed her a headband in the colors of AS Roma, or for Berzi, bright yellow and red, just like the ones worn in the stands at the time. In the family photograph, which became the main image in all the reports on the case, Emanuela is smiling, looking slightly away from the camera. She's wearing the headband, but no glasses. An ordinary photo, the sort every family has hundreds of. She lived within a state that operated by its own rules, its own jurisdiction, its own court, its own prison. The Italian police had no right to enter its territory without permission. Outside lay Rome, with its noise, heat, and population of millions. Emanuela traveled between these two worlds every day, the Sacre on the bus with a flute in her hands, wearing glasses which she preferred not to wear. On the 22nd of June 1983, the temperature in Rome was around 35 degrees. The June heat in the city feels different from that outside it. The scorching tarmac, the sun-baked building facades, the hot air that barely stirs through the narrow streets. That morning, Emanuela had had a row with her brother Pietro. She had asked him to give her a lift to school, and he had refused. She left, slamming the door behind her. It was the usual route she had taken many times before. A few stops by bus from the Vatican gates, then a short walk to the Institute of Sacred Music, housed in an old palazzo next to Piazza Sant'Apollinare. A flute lesson, then back again. At around 6 in the evening, she rang home from a payphone. Federica's sister answered the phone. Emanuela explained that a man had approached her in the street. He had offered her a part-time job at a fashion show, handing out Avon Cosmetics leaflets. The pay for a few hours was 375,000 lire, which at the exchange rate at the time was equivalent to about $200, a sum completely implausible for such work. The man was standing next to a dark green BMW. Federica tried to talk her out of it and asked her to speak to her parents first. It is not known exactly what Emanuela said. The conversation ended. She hung up. At around 6:30 in the evening, Emanuela left her lesson 10 minutes earlier than usual. 2 of her classmates, including Laura Casagrande, boarded the crowded bus. Emanuela stayed at the bus stop to wait for the next one. Standing next to her was another girl, whose identity the investigation has never established. The bus stop was on Corso Rinascimento, near Palazzo Madama, the building where the Italian Senate sits, a bustling spot right in the heart of Rome. People, cars, voices, the clamor of the street. It was here that Emanuela was last seen at 7:30 in the evening. She didn't come home. The family waited until it got dark. Then they started phoning friends, the head of the music school, and hospitals. There was no answer. During the night, her father went to the police station. They listened to him and suggested he wait until morning. The girl was most likely staying with friends, and there was nothing to worry about. For the next 2 days, the family took matters into their own hands. They put up posters around Rome bearing Emanuela's photograph and placed advertisements in newspapers such as Il Tempo, Paese Sera, and Il Messaggero. On 23rd of June, Emanuela was officially reported missing. Among the family's acquaintances was Giulio Gongi, an agent with SISDE, the Italian counterintelligence service, responsible for the country's internal security. He immediately launched his own investigation. He questioned the police officers on duty at the Palazzo Madama that evening, walked the surrounding streets, and called upon his contacts. Within a few days, Gagny had tracked down a dark green BMW. The car was found at a garage. Upon inspection, one detail became clear. The side window had been smashed from the inside. The car belonged to a certain blonde woman. Shortly afterwards, the management removed Gagny from the investigation. Without explanation, the police officers on duty that evening outside the Palazzo Madama subsequently gave conflicting accounts. One of them claimed to have seen Emanuela with the Avon man before the music lesson. Another said it happened around 7 in the evening, after the lesson had finished. These two were describing the same street, the same day, the same person. Yet they could not even agree on exactly when what they had seen had taken place. Rome carried on as usual. The heat showed no sign of abating. A few days later, alongside the missing person notices for the girl, the city's newspapers carried reports of another incident that had occurred just the day before her disappearance. On the 18th of June, 1983, a man was found hanged beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. He turned out to be Roberto Calvi, a banker whom financial circles dubbed the banker to God due to his close ties with the Vatican. His bank, Banco Ambrosiano, had collapsed shortly before, leaving behind debts amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars, some of which were directly linked to the Holy See's banking structures. According to one version of the investigation, organized crime in Rome was involved in that collapse. The girl with the flute and the banker under the London Bridge. At the time, they seemed like two separate stories. Later, investigators would return time and again to the fact that they had taken place 4 days apart. In the days immediately following Emanuela's disappearance, the Italian police proceeded without any particular sense of urgency. A report of a missing minor in Rome in 1983 was nothing out of the ordinary. The city was large. Teenagers sometimes ran away from home, and most of them returned. The investigators interviewed several witnesses near Palazzo Madama, recorded their statements, which immediately differed in detail, and continued their work at the usual pace. The family didn't sit around waiting. Mom and Dad walked the streets with bundles of leaflets. Pietro, the eldest brother, who was in his early 20s at the time, drove around several neighborhoods, popping into cafes and asking strangers for information. The newspaper advertisements yielded the first response. On 25th of June, a young man calling himself Pierluigi rang. He said he had seen a girl with a flute one of the days after she disappeared. On 27th of June, a bar owner named Mario came forward. He'd seen someone similar too. Both leads were investigated. Both turned out to be dead ends. Meanwhile, the Italian security services gave the Orlandi family one practical piece of advice: to record all incoming phone calls. The equipment was installed quickly, and it proved useful straight away. On July 5th, 2 weeks after her disappearance, a man whom the investigation would later refer to as the American rang the Orlandi family home. The voice spoke Italian with a foreign accent. He did not introduce himself. He said he knew where Emanuela was, and that she was alive. There was one condition for her release. The Vatican must secure the release of Mehmet Ali Agca from an Italian prison. In Italy in 1983, that name needed no introduction. 2 years earlier, on 13th May 1981, the Turkish hitman Mehmet Ali Agca walked out onto St. Peter's Square and shot Pope John Paul II from a distance of a few meters. The Pope survived. Agca was arrested at the scene and sentenced to life imprisonment in an Italian prison. Now an unknown voice was demanding his release in exchange for a 15-year-old girl. Soon, calls began coming in to the American from a group calling themselves Turkish. The messages all conveyed the same message: release Agca, and you'll get Emanuela. No group by that name was listed in the Italian police databases. The Vatican's response came as a surprise. Instead of handing the negotiations entirely over to the Italian authorities, the Holy See established a direct telephone line of communication with the kidnappers via the office of the Secretary of State, Cardinal Agostino Casaroli. The Secretary of State is, in essence, the head of the Vatican government, second only to the Pope. Negotiations regarding the fate of the missing girl were conducted directly with the state's highest administrative leadership. On July 3, 1983, less than 2 weeks after Emanuela's disappearance, Pope John Paul II mentioned her name in public. During the Sunday Angelus prayer, he addressed the crowd gathered in St. Peter's Square and mentioned the missing girl, a Vatican citizen, and the daughter of one of his staff members. It was an unprecedented move. Popes do not read out the names of missing persons from the balcony. On July 17th, an audio cassette was found at the ANSA news agency's office in Rome. It had been left without a signature or any accompanying note. When the cassette was played, the recording featured the voice of a young woman screaming and moaning. The recording had clearly been made under circumstances which the investigation classified as torture. The Orlandi family listened to the recording. Pietro, her brother, expressed doubts. He was not sure that the voice belonged to his sister. The police issued an official statement. The voice on the tape could not be identified, and it has not been confirmed that it belongs to Emanuela. However, there was another view regarding this recording. Antonio Asciore, a former agent of the Italian political intelligence service, Digos, later claimed that the original tape was longer. According to him, the recording featured male voices in the background, which were absent from the version provided to the press and the family. Asciore claimed that the recording had been edited before being released, and that what the family received was an edited version of the original. The investigation was unable to establish exactly who edited the post, or indeed, whether any editing had taken place at all. That same month, July, another discovery was made. Photocopies of 2 documents were found in a rubbish bin outside the Italian Parliament building: Emanuela's music school membership card and a receipt for her tuition fees. Both documents belonged to Emanuela. Both had been left by the American as proof that he was indeed connected to her. The investigators noticed one detail. The originals of these documents were kept in the archives of the Institute of Sacred Music. The Institute fell under the jurisdiction of the Vatican. Access to its archives was restricted. By the autumn of 1983, the calls from the American had become more frequent. He mentioned details that could not have been known to anyone who had not been in direct contact with Emanuela or her circle. In one conversation, he described in detail the arrangement of the moles on her back. This information had never been published. It was known to no one outside the family and, perhaps, her doctor. In December 1983, Pope John Paul II met with the Orlandi family. During the meeting, he told them directly, Emanuela's case is a matter of international terrorism. The Holy See is doing everything humanly possible to ensure a favorable outcome. The term international terrorism was used by the Pope. The Vatican has taken an official stance. Foreign forces linked to the attempt on the Pope's life are behind the kidnapping. The investigation treated this theory as the main line of inquiry for several years. At the same time, Italian prosecutors were following leads pointing to the Bulgarian secret services, and through them, to Soviet intelligence. It was these very organizations, according to one theory, that were behind the assassination attempt in 1981. Years later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Günter Bonsack, a former officer of the East German secret police, the Stasi, gave evidence to German investigators. According to him, the letters and phone calls purporting to be from the Turkish group, which demanded Agci's release in exchange for Emanuela, had been fabricated. The operation was called Papst. It was organized by the GDR intelligence service on behalf of the KGB with a single aim: to divert the attention of Western intelligence agencies and the media away from the Bulgarian link in the assassination attempt on the Pope. According to this version, Emanuela Orlandi was not the subject of political bargaining, but a tool of disinformation. The court in Rome ultimately agreed with this assessment. In December 1997, the first official investigation was closed. The theory of international terrorism was deemed a red herring, deliberate misinformation that the investigation had pursued for more than 10 years. By that point, Emmanuel had been missing for 14 years, but whilst the investigation was following the terrorist lead, other evidence was quietly being gathered on the sidelines. In the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, the television program Chi l'ha visto, the Italian equivalent of missing persons shows, returned to the Orlandi case on several occasions. After one of the episodes, an anonymous tipster rang the studio. He said he knew who was behind the abduction, and he gave a name: Enrico De Pedis, one of the leaders of the Banda della Magliana, a Roman organized crime gang which, in the 1980s, controlled a significant portion of the capital's criminal underworld. By that time, the Banda della Magliana had already been the subject of several major criminal investigations. Its history was well known to the investigators. Less well known, but documented, was another fact. Enrico De Pedis, killed in 1990 during a gangland feud, was buried not in the municipal cemetery, but in the crypt of the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare, the very same palazzo next to which stood the Institute of Sacred Music where Emanuela studied. According to available information, De Pedis obtained the right to be buried in this basilica, which belonged to the Vatican, from Cardinal Ugo Paletti, then Vicar General of Rome. As church circles explained, for services rendered. It was not officially explained exactly what these services were. The link between the mafia boss buried in a Vatican basilica, 100 meters from Emanuela's music school, and her disappearance was limited to anonymous phone calls. The investigators noted the information, but did not actively pursue this line of inquiry. The initial investigation was closed without ever getting to the bottom of it. The case has been filed away. It has officially been classified as unsolved. Years passed, then decades. Rome changed, governments changed, popes changed. The Orlandi family continued to live in their flat in the Vatican. The mother remained within the same walls where Emanuela had grown up. Her brother Pietro continued to give interviews, write letters, and attend receptions hosted by officials. He became the face of the case, the only person preventing it from fading completely from the public eye. In 2008, the case was formally reopened. New investigators, new requests for information, and new witness interviews. This time, the focus was on the line of inquiry linked to the Banda della Magliana. One of the key witnesses was Sabrina Minardi, Enrico De Pedis' former lover. She stated that she had personally taken part in Emanuela's abduction. According to her, she took the girl to a specific location and handed her over to a man dressed as a priest. She named the man who, she claimed, had given the order, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who at that time headed the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for Religious Works. Minardi's testimony sounded like a direct accusation against one of the church's senior officials. But on closer inspection, it fell apart when examined in detail. In different statements, she named different locations where Emanuela was allegedly being held. Among the people she named as accomplices were individuals who had died before 1983. That is, before the abduction itself. The chronology of events in her accounts did not add up. Investigators noted that Minardi suffered from drug addiction. Her statements varied from one interrogation to the next, and it was not possible to verify them independently. Nevertheless, it was her testimony that provided the investigators with a formal basis for doing what an anonymous informant had suggested back in the 1990s, to open De Pettis' crypt in the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare. In May 2012, the test was carried out. Journalists, cameramen, investigators, and family members were all awaiting the results. No DNA belonging to Emanuela Orlandi was found in the crypt. De Pettis' body was there, nothing else. Whilst the investigation was focusing on the Banda della Magliana, information of a completely different nature emerged from another source. In 2012, the Italian journalist Emiliano Fittipaldi published an article based on documents stolen from the Vatican archives during the scandal that went down in history as Vatileaks. Among these documents was a 5-page memorandum. According to its contents, after her disappearance, Emanuela Orlandi was taken to London, where she was placed in the care of Vatican authorities. The document detailed the cost of her upkeep, education, and medical care over a period of 14 years, from 1983 to 1997. The total amount came to around 250,000 euros. A letter signed by the Archbishop of Canterbury was attached to the memorandum. If the document was genuine, it implied that the Vatican not only knew of Emanuela's whereabouts immediately after her disappearance, but had also been funding her life abroad for 14 years, at the very time when her family were putting up posters around Rome and her brother was visiting government offices. The Vatican declared the document to be a forgery. The former Archbishop of Canterbury also denied the authenticity of the letter, bearing his signature. No independent examination of the document was carried out. The original remained in the journalist's possession, and the Vatican did not allow independent experts to examine it. The year 2015, the second official investigation by the Italian Public Prosecutor's Office, the one that was reopened in 2008 following Minardi's testimony and the exhumation of the crypt, was closed. The investigators concluded that there was no new, verified evidence sufficient to sustain the charges. 32 years have passed since the disappearance. The second investigation ended just as the first had. Nevertheless, one detail from that period remains unexplained. In 2013, a man named Marco Acchetti came forward to the investigators. He claimed that he had personally taken part in the abduction of Emanuela Orlandi and another girl who went missing that same year, Morella Gregori. To back up his story, he brought a flute. According to him, it was the instrument that had belonged to Emanuela. The Orlandi family examined the flute and initially believed it to be hers. However, the music teacher who had taught Emanuela was categorical. His pupil had owned a different make of instrument. No DNA was found on the flute. In 2024, a voice analysis was carried out. Experts compared recordings of Acchetti's voice with surviving recordings of calls made by the American and by a certain Mario. The results showed an 86% match. This is a high figure, but insufficient for a legal conviction. The investigators themselves described Acchetti as a pathological liar, whose testimony contained verifiable details mixed with obvious fabrications. There was no clear way to distinguish one from the other. In October 2018, builders carrying out renovation work on the building housing the Papal Nunciature, the Vatican's diplomatic mission in Rome, discovered human bones in a wall. The news spread immediately through the Italian media. The Orlandi family requested a DNA test. The Vatican agreed. Forensic analysis has shown that the bones belong to a man. The remains have been dated to approximately 190 to 230 AD. A few months later, in early 2019, an anonymous letter arrived at the Vatican. Attached to the letter was a photograph. a marble statue of an angel in the Teutonic Cemetery, a small German cemetery within the Vatican walls, one of the few places within the state's territory to which outsiders are admitted. The angel is holding a book bearing the inscription, Requiescat in pace. May he rest in peace. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Look where the angel is looking." Investigators received official permission to open 2 specific tombs, those of 2 19th-century German princesses. In July 1900, amidst a large gathering of journalists and officials, the tombs were opened. The sarcophagi turned out to be empty. They contained neither the princesses' remains nor anything else. The Vatican was unable to explain where the bodies, buried as far back as the 19th century, had disappeared to. This question hung in the air alongside another. Who had written the anonymous letter? And how did that person know to look for something here? They didn't find a manual there either. Over the past 42 years, several theories have emerged regarding the case of Emanuela Orlandi. Each has its own supporting arguments. None of them, however, is backed by evidence that a court would consider sufficient. The first and officially recognized theory: international terrorism. The abduction was carried out as a political means of exerting pressure on the Vatican to secure the release from an Italian prison of Mehmet Ali Acha, the man who shot the Pope. Behind the operation was a foreign intelligence service, which exploited the girl's actual disappearance to set up a disinformation campaign designed to cover up the Bulgarian and Soviet links to the assassination attempt of 1981. There was much to support this version of events. The kidnappers knew details that were not available to outsiders, including the location of the moles on Emanuela's back. This information had never been made public and, in all likelihood, could only have been obtained from someone who knew the girl personally or had access to her medical records. The direct channel of communication with the Vatican's Secretary of State was real and documented. The Holy See has never denied this. The confession by former Stasi officer Günter Bonsack regarding the fabrication of letters in the name of the Turkish group as part of Operation Papst was made under oath to German investigators. Mehmet Ali Acha himself stated on numerous occasions over the years that he knew where Emanuela was, offered to cooperate with Italian investigators, and named specific individuals. Yet each time his claims were contradicted by the verifiable facts. In 1997, a court in Rome ruled that this version of events, specifically regarding the actual demands for Agi's release, constituted deliberate misinformation. However, this did not explain who was actually behind the abduction itself, nor where the girl had gone. The court left unanswered the question of whether Emanuela's actual disappearance had been used as a cover for a special operation, or whether the operation itself had caused her disappearance. The second theory: organized crime and the Vatican's financial debt. According to this theory, the Banda della Magliana kidnapped Emanuela as a means of putting pressure on the church over the financial losses the gang had suffered following the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano in 1982. Through this bank, which was closely linked to the Vatican's Institute for Religious Works, criminal money was laundered and invested. When the bank collapsed, the mafia lost significant funds. The banker Roberto Calvi, found hanged beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge 4 days before Emanuela's disappearance, was one of the key figures in this scheme. The Italian investigation subsequently concluded that Calvi had been murdered rather than having taken his own life. The burial of Boss de Pedis in the Vatican's Basilica of Sant'Apollinare, in recognition of services rendered to Cardinal Poletto, is a documented fact that has not been officially disputed by anyone. It pointed to close and opaque ties between the church and organized crime during that period. Convicted mafioso Antonio Mancini, a former gang member, gave evidence to investigators in 2008, stating that Orlandi's abduction had been organized by the gang. An audio recording of another convicted criminal, Marcello Neroni, discovered later, contained statements confirming that the gang's involvement in the disappearance and the link between this event and the Vatican sex scandals. However, another factor undermined this theory. The testimony of the key witness, Sabrina Minardi, fell apart under scrutiny on too many points to be accepted in its entirety. The empty De Pettis crypt yielded nothing. There is still no direct, verifiable evidence in the case file linking the gang to Emanuela's fate. The third theory, an internal Vatican scandal. According to this theory, the disappearance is linked to sexual abuse within the Holy See itself. The Vatican's exorcist Gabriele Amorth, one of the most famous clergymen of his time, publicly stated shortly before his death in 2016 that Emanuela had been abducted to take part in orgies organized by some members of the Vatican clergy. According to available information, one of Emanuela's friends recounted that shortly before her disappearance, she had complained to her about being harassed in the Vatican gardens by someone close to the Pope. There is an audio recording in which the convicted mafioso Marcello Neroni confirms a similar version of events. Journalist Tommaso Nelli, who covered the case for many years, also publicly spoke in favor of this version. It would explain why the Vatican has so consistently refused to cooperate with the Italian investigation and why a file, the existence of which was denied for 40 years, remains classified to this day. Its contents are too damaging to the Church's reputation to be made public. This version is undermined by the lack of any documentary evidence. All those named in the case are dead. The accounts of living witnesses have not been verified. The version relies on audio recordings of convicted criminals and public statements by people who themselves admitted that they had no direct evidence. The fourth theory, the London Lead. A secret document from the Vatican archives, published as part of VatiLeaks, indicated that Emanuela was alive and had been in London under Vatican care from 1983 to 1997. If the document is genuine, her disappearance could have been either a voluntary departure or a forced relocation organized by the Vatican itself. Against, the Holy See insists that the document is a forgery. No independent expert analysis has been carried out. The fifth theory, a serial offender. Detectives Othello Lupacini and journalist Max Parisi developed a theory that Emanuela Orlandi and Morella Gregori, another teenage girl who disappeared in Rome in the same year, 1983, under similar circumstances, had fallen victim to the same person. Both had been lured by the promise of easy money. The modus operandi was the same. The identity of the possible perpetrator could not be established. The sixth theory, the uncle's involvement. In 2023, Vatican investigators released information to the media suggesting the possible involvement of Emanuela's uncle, Mario Meneguzzi. According to a letter from the cardinal found in the archives, the uncle had previously made verbal sexual advances towards Emanuela's older sister, Natalina. Investigators suggested that he might have been the person who offered the girl a job at Palazzo Madama. The Orlandi family met this theory with open indignation. On the day of her disappearance, the uncle was with the family out of town, in Borgo Rose, and this is documented. Pietro Orlandi accused the Vatican of deliberately attempting to divert attention onto the family in order to protect its own people. None of these versions exists in a vacuum. They overlap, contradict one another, and from time to time, unexpectedly converge at the same points. Vatican funds, the mafia, and sealed archives. None of them has been definitively ruled out. None has been proven. What is known for certain is that no one has come forward publicly who could explain how the caller, the American, knew about the moles on the 15-year-old girl's back. Exactly what De Pettis did for Cardinal Paletti has never been officially established. No one has explained why Agent Gangi was removed from the investigation a few days after he found the car in question. The Vatican remains silent on where the princesses' bodies disappeared to from the tombs in the Teutonic Cemetery. For years, Pietro Orlandi repeated the same thing. He said that the only thing he was certain of was that the Vatican knew the truth. Their silence makes them complicit, he said in an interview, referring to the successive popes. When he finally got an audience with Pope Francis in 2013, the Pope listened to him, and then he said, "Emanuela is in heaven." Pietro Orlandi later recounted that he didn't know what to say. He had gone over the conversation in his head so many times beforehand that when it finally happened, he was lost for words. "I told myself so many times, if only I'd seen her off back then, perhaps this wouldn't have happened," he said in a later interview. For nearly 20 years, from the closure of the second investigation in 2015 until the renewed wave of interest in the early 2020s, the case existed primarily as a cultural phenomenon. It lived on in books. Several journalists wrote detailed investigations, each with its own focus and its own version of events. It lived on in Italian forums and discussions, where over 40 years, thousands of pages of theories, speculation, and testimonies had accumulated. It lived on within the family, the mother in her Vatican flat, the brother in interviews, repeating the same words with the same intonation. The Italian authorities had lost interest in the case. The Vatican remained silent. The case was listed as unsolved, and this phrasing had become routine, as if it implied closure rather than simply the absence of an answer. Brother Pietro never let up. He continued to attend meetings with officials, continued to give interviews, and continued to seek audiences. From time to time, Italian journalists wrote about him as a man for whom a single date, June 22nd, 1983, had become the focal point around which his whole life revolved. He never hid this. He spoke about it openly. In 2022, the Netflix documentary series Vatican Girl, directed by Mark Lewis, was released. It consists of 4 episodes. It garnered several million views in its first few weeks. A new generation, who had no memory of 1983, learned about Emanuela Orlandi. On her birthday, 14th January, small gatherings began to take place once again in St. Peter's Square. Thousands of posts appeared on social media, all asking the same question. The girl's name reappeared in the news across Europe. It was against this backdrop, at the start of 2023, that the family finally achieved what they had been striving for over the past 40 years. The Vatican announced the launch of its own official investigation. For the first time in history, the Holy See established an investigative body with the authority to work on the case from within. Alessandro Didi was appointed chief prosecutor. At the same time, the Italian parliament voted to establish a special bicameral committee of inquiry with broad powers. The Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. The committee's hearings began in 2023 and continued in earnest from January to April 2026, during which further rounds of witness questioning took place. At the end of 2024, Prosecutor Didi made a statement that no other Vatican official had ever made before. He said, "The file Pietro Orlandi is referring to does exist. We have found it, but its contents are confidential." For 41 years, the Vatican denied the very existence of this file. In December 2025, Laura Casagrande came under formal investigation. The very friend who was the last person to see Emanuela alive at the bus stop near Palazzo Madama. For decades, she had given statements that investigators described as contradictory. In some interviews, she remembered details. In others, she did not. The chronology of her statements kept changing. In 2025, she was charged with withholding information and giving false evidence. Casagrande was by Emanuela's side during the last known moments of her life, at that very bus stop where, On a sweltering June evening in '83, a crowded bus had separated the two friends. Casagrande left. Emanuela stayed behind. Exactly what Casagrande knew, and why she remained silent for 42 years, remains unclear, even if the investigation is correct in its suspicions. Her case is being heard in parallel with the work of the Parliamentary Commission. These two processes are proceeding simultaneously, without any public overlap, at the start of 2026. The Vatican investigation is also ongoing. Prosecutor Didi is not giving any interviews regarding the substance of the case. The file has been classified. There have been no official statements as to when, or indeed if, its contents will be disclosed. Emanuela's mother still lives in the Vatican, in the same flat, in the same country that granted her daughter citizenship over 40 years ago. Pietro Orlandi continues to give interviews. He is now an elderly man, but his words remain unchanged. The Vatican knows. The Vatican remains silent. The file exists. Its contents are classified. The Institute of Sacred Music still stands in Rome, near Piazza Sant'Apollinare. Students come and go. Buses still run along Corso Rinascimento. The bus stop by Palazzo Madama is just as it was. The pavement, the curb, the stream of traffic. It is hot here in summer. The air barely stirs between the old facades. There is neither a plaque nor a sign at this spot. Nothing indicates that anything ever happened here. An ordinary bus stop in the center of Rome, one of hundreds. On the 22nd of June 1983, a 15-year-old girl holding a flute was last seen here. She was waiting for the bus. Standing nearby was an unknown girl whose identity has never been established. The bus arrived. What happened next remains unknown. 42 years have passed since then. An investigation has been launched. The file has been classified. Emmanuel has not been found. In northwestern Canada lies a valley to which no road leads. 30,000 square kilometers of taiga, granite canyons 1,000 meters deep, and rivers capable of capsizing a boat in June. Official maps of this place bear names not usually given to national parks. Valley of the Dead, Headless Creek, Funeral Ridge. Since the early 20th century, at least 44 people have gone missing or died here. Some were found headless, next to burnt-out huts. In June 2005, 2 men from Fort Simpson set off for this valley on a 4-day hunting trip. David Horesi and Frederick Hardesty were neither tourists nor novices. Both were members of Canada's Indigenous peoples, and both were regarded as highly experienced hunters and experts on the wilderness. This was familiar territory to them. 4 days later, the owner of the cabin returned to check on them and found the doors locked, the food supplies untouched, all the firearms still in place, and smoldering fires around the perimeter. The hunters themselves were nowhere to be seen. The search for them lasted almost a month. David's body was found 4 kilometers from the cabin, in thick undergrowth. Fred's body was found in the river, 20 kilometers away. Search parties had already combed both areas previously. But the most baffling thing about this story is not how they died, but what happened in the hut before they fled. David Horesi was 60 years old. Frederick Hardesty, whom everyone called Fred, was about the same age. Both lived in Fort Simpson, a small settlement at the confluence of the Liard and Mackenzie rivers, where temperatures drop below -40 in winter, and the nearest major town is several hundred kilometers away as the crow flies. People who knew them all said the same thing. Inseparable friends, both had grown up in the forest. Both could read the terrain as easily as a city dweller reads road signs. They didn't just go into the taiga. The taiga was part of their everyday life. Hunting, trapping. Long expeditions to places most people never reach in a lifetime. It was precisely this that subsequently stumped everyone trying to make sense of what had happened. When an inexperienced hiker goes missing, an explanation is usually found quickly. They got lost, overestimated their strength, or didn't know the area. But David and Fred knew the area. They knew how to behave if they encountered a bear. They knew that without weapons and supplies, you cannot survive in the taiga. They knew that you do not leave a hut to venture into the forest at night empty-handed. And yet, by all accounts, that is exactly what they did. The Nahanni Valley is located in Canada's Northwest Territories, in the Daicho region. The South Nahanni River, which gave the place its name, flows through 4 deep canyons carved into limestone and granite over millions of years. Virginia Falls plunges from a height of 96 meters, which is twice as high as Niagara Falls. In 1978, the valley was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List, one of the first natural sites in the world to be included. The national park covers an area comparable to that of Belgium. Between 800 and 1,000 people visit the park every year. But long before UNESCO and the national park, this place had a different reputation. The Dene people, who have lived in the valley's surroundings for over 9,000 years, passed down tales from generation to generation about the Naha tribe. Mountain people who would descend from the peaks, raid settlements in the lowlands, and vanish without a trace. When the Dene warriors once climbed into the mountains to launch a counterattack, they found only smoldering fires and empty teepees. The Naha had vanished, an entire tribe, without leaving any explanation. After that, certain parts of the valley were considered off-limits. The Dene gave them a wide berth. White settlers arrived in the valley at the start of the 20th century, during the Klondike Gold Rush. Among the first were the MacLeod brothers, Willie and Frank, Métis from Fort Laird. In 1904, they traveled upriver and struck gold. They returned with samples and told their friends that a fortune lay there. In 1905, they set off again. A Scottish engineer, whose name remains unknown, went with them. No one ever saw them alive again. 3 years later, Charlie MacLeod's brother organized a search party. On the riverbank, at the spot that has since been known as the Valley of the Dead, he found 2 skeletons. Both had been decapitated. One lay with an arm outstretched towards a rifle. The other, judging by the position of the body, had leapt out of bed. The Scottish engineer was never found. The brothers' heads were never found either. Since then, the stream near this spot has been called Headless Creek. In 1917, the body of Martin Jorgensen, a Swiss gold prospector, was discovered in the valley. Shortly before his death, he had written to his friends, saying he had struck a rich vein. His decapitated skeleton lay beside the charred remains of a hut. A rifle with the hammer cocked remained in the ashes. The gold was never found. 10 years later, almost in the same spot, the body of a fugitive prospector nicknamed Yukon Fisher was discovered, headless, next to a burnt-out camp with a rifle melted by the heat. In 1945, an unnamed miner from Ontario was found in a sleeping bag near a burnt-out tent. He too was headless. There were also those who simply vanished. Prospector Angus Hall went ahead of his group in 1928 and never returned. 2 gold prospectors, Joe Mulholland and Bill Epierre, went missing in 1936. All that remained of them was a hut, burnt to the ground. A woman named Annie Laferte went missing in the valley in 1926 whilst out hunting. Several months later, a local hunter nicknamed Big Charlie claimed to have seen her. She was scrambling up a rocky slope, completely naked and clearly out of her mind. No one saw her again. Decapitated bodies, burnt-out huts, missing gold. By the mid-20th century, the pattern had become clear, though no one could explain it. Journalists dubbed the Valley of the Headless, and the nickname stuck more firmly than any official name. The police attributed the deaths to the harsh climate, bears, and human greed. The Dene shook their heads and repeated, "We warned you." The cabin where David and Fred arrived on June 12, 2005 belonged to their friend Rod Gunderson. It stood on the banks of the North Nahanni River, 125 kilometers northwest of Fort Simpson. It was a log cabin, solidly built, and familiar to both of them. They had been there before. Gunderson had driven them there, made sure everything was in order, and left. The plan was simple: 4 days of hunting, and on June 16th, Gunderson would return to pick them both up. The cabin had everything needed for a peaceful expedition: food supplies, firewood, and firearms. It was a cool June in the Northwest Territories when the sun barely sets. But at night, the temperature can drop low enough to make it truly cold without shelter. The river beside the hut carried icy water down from the mountain slopes. All around, as far as the eye could see, stretched dense scrub, that very thick bush through which search parties would later have to struggle for weeks on end. David and Fred were there. Their weapons were within reach. There was plenty of food. The hut stood firm. Everything looked exactly as it should for the start of a typical 4-day hunt, for which both had been preparing their whole lives. On June 16th, Rod Gunderson returned to the cabin as agreed. The doors were locked. Gunderson opened them and saw that everything inside was still in its place: food, firewood, and equipment. The hunting rifles were leaning against the wall. There was no note. Outside, around the perimeter of the hut, the embers of several small fires were still smoldering. Such fires are usually lit for one purpose: to scare off wild animals. The smoke was still rising, which meant the fires had been tended to not long ago. David and Fred were nowhere to be seen, neither in the hut nor anywhere near it. There were no clues as to where they had gone. There seemed to be no apparent reason why two experienced hunters would abandon everything they needed to survive and head into the taiga empty-handed. Rod Gunderson has reported him missing. On June 18th, 2 days after Gunderson discovered the empty cabin, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police joined the search. The RCMP, as it is commonly known, is Canada's federal police force, responsible for both criminal investigations and law enforcement in the remote northern regions. The nearest post was at Fort Simpson. From there, it was 125 kilometers as the crow flies to Gunderson's cabin, and it could only be reached by helicopter or by water. The first few days were spent gathering people and getting them to the scene. Just over 1,000 people live in Fort Simpson. It's a small town where everyone knows one another, and the news that David and Fred hadn't returned spread faster than any official statement. There was something off about the news. It wasn't random tourists who had gone missing, but locals, people it was hard to imagine finding themselves in a helpless situation. The area around the hut was thick, almost impenetrable scrub, beyond which lay the taiga forest, stretching in all directions without any roads or clearings. The North Nahanni River flowed nearby, cold, fast-moving, and unpredictable. The air smelled of damp pine needles and river clay. Mosquitoes rose from the water in thick clouds, and by midday, there was no escape from them. Covering such terrain on foot meant moving slowly, a few hundred meters an hour, pushing aside branches, climbing over fallen trees, losing sight of one's neighbor in the chain, even at arm's length. The police organized search parties. They were joined by local residents from Fort Simpson and other settlements in the Decho region, as well as relatives of the missing men, including Fred's brother. The riverbanks were searched by canoe, and sections of the forest were combed through by foot patrols. An officer from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources brought a thermal imager, a device capable of detecting the heat signature of a living body through foliage. The result was negative. 5 days later, on June 23rd, the RCMP wound down their part of the operation. No official explanation was given. The police packed up their equipment, and the helicopter flew back to Fort Simpson. The search efforts were handed over to local residents and relatives, who continued to search on their own. For the families, this was the first blow. The federal police had withdrawn after just 5 days of work, having found neither bodies nor clues, nor any answers. 5 days to cover 30,000 square kilometers of taiga. Those who stayed behind to search knew the area better than the police. They walked along the riverbanks, ventured deep into the forest, and checked every hollow and every ravine. June in these parts means white nights. The sun barely sets, and it is possible to search for 20 hours a day. People searched until they had no strength left, slept for a few hours, and started again. The search area expanded gradually. First, the immediate vicinity of the hut, then a kilometer, 2, 3, 5. Canoes traveled down the North Nahanni, scanning the banks, the shallows, and the places where the river slowed and the current might have washed something or someone ashore. By that point, the cabin had already been searched by the police. Inside, everything remained untouched. Food, firewood, and hunting rifles by the wall. Nothing was missing. The doors were locked when Gunderson returned on June 16th, which meant that the cabin had been locked from the inside or with a key from the outside. But Gunderson had the key. So either the men had locked the door themselves and left via another exit, or the door was secured by a bolt that could only be drawn from the inside. In any case, they had left, leaving behind everything that might have saved their lives, locked behind that door. Outside, along the perimeter, there were traces of several campfires, not just one, but several, arranged around the hut. Such fires are lit when it is necessary to create a smoke screen or a ring of fire to scare off wild animals, bears, wolverines, wolves. This is standard practice, which both hunters knew only too well. But standard practice assumes that the person remains inside the shelter, keeping their weapon close at hand. David and Fred had lit the fires, and then abandoned the fires, the weapons, and the hut. On the 28th of June, on the 16th day of the search, the team discovered David Horesi's body. He was lying in thick undergrowth, 3.7 kilometers from the hut. It was an area that search parties had already combed through several times. The undergrowth here was so dense that one could only make one's way through by pushing the branches aside with one's hands, and visibility in any direction was limited to a few meters. A searcher could have walked 2 steps away from the body and not noticed it. Later, this became the official explanation for why the body had not been found earlier. The undergrowth was too thick. The explanation sounded reasonable, but it required believing that dozens of people who had been combing the area for weeks had walked right past it, time and time again. Jonas Antoine, a friend of both families and a member of the search party, was present when the body was discovered. He noticed a detail that official reports subsequently made almost no mention of. David had burn marks on his hands and forearms. Antoine later spoke openly about this. Horesi had burns on his hands and forearms. The cause of death, established later during a post-mortem examination in Edmonton, was recorded as hypothermia, that is, exposure to the cold. June in the Northwest Territories, even with long daylight hours, is cold enough at night for a person without shelter or warm clothing to freeze to death. Toxicological analysis revealed no presence of alcohol or drugs in the body. There were no gunshot wounds on the body, nor were there any signs of an animal attack. No bites, no scratches, and no lacerations. One question remained, one that the post-mortem could not answer. Why did a man with burns on his hands, who knew the area and was capable of surviving in the taiga, end up 4 kilometers away from a warm hut full of food and weapons, and freeze to death? The search for Fred continued. After David was found, it became even more important to locate the second hunter, dead or alive. By that point, hope had all but vanished. If David, found 4 kilometers from the cabin, had frozen to death, then Fred, who had not been found at all, could hardly have survived 3 weeks in the taiga without supplies. But there was no body, and the family continued to search. The search teams expanded the search area, shifting their focus to the river. At this point, the North Nahanni has a fast, cold current capable of carrying an object or a body a considerable distance in a single day. In June, the water is murky from melting mountain snow, making it virtually impossible to see anything beneath the surface. They surveyed the banks again, this time moving further away from the cabin, 10, 15, 20 kilometers downstream. The canoes moved slowly, the men scanning every backwater, every log jam, every sandbank where the current might have washed a body ashore. On July 5th, almost 3 weeks after the search began, a police dog was brought in from Grand Prairie in the province of Alberta. This meant that by that point, the RCMP had rejoined the investigation, albeit in a limited capacity. The dog was taken to the scene, but the search using it yielded no results. On July 8th, 22 days after his disappearance, a search party discovered Frederick Hardisty's body. It was floating in the North Nahanni River, approximately 20 kilometers from the cabin. The current at that point was strong enough to carry the body, but open enough for it to be spotted from the bank or from a canoe. And this was the second time the body had been found in a spot they had already searched. Search parties had combed that stretch of the river several times, by canoe and on foot along the bank. The body hadn't been there. And then it appeared. There were 2 possible explanations for this. Either the body had been underwater or hidden in the reeds by the bank all along, unseen by the searchers, and had surfaced later. Or it had been carried by the current from another location after this stretch had already been searched. Both explanations were plausible. Neither dispelled the feeling that the river had returned Fred on its own schedule. An autopsy carried out in Edmonton determined the cause of death to be drowning. As with David, the toxicology report was clear. No gunshot wounds were found. No signs of an animal attack were found. No signs of a struggle were found. 2 bodies. 2 different ways of dying. One froze to death, the other drowned. Both were found in areas that had already been searched. Both showed no signs of violence, no alcohol in their blood, and no gunshot wounds, despite the fact that the hut they had left was riddled with bullets. It was the hut that remained at the heart of the mystery. Upon inspection, numerous bullet holes were discovered inside. Fred's brother, Robert Hardisty, who had visited the scene, described what he saw in words that subsequently became one of the most frequently quoted phrases in connection with the case. He said that there were bullet marks everywhere and that there was a bullet hole in the floor of the hut. Robert was convinced that the picture of what had happened was far more complex than simply 2 men, one of whom had died of hypothermia and the other of drowning. According to him, something else had happened beforehand. Among the items found in the hut was a t-shirt that had been shot right through. The bullet had passed through the fabric, leaving characteristic entry and exit wounds. However, none of the bodies showed any bullet wounds. Neither David nor Fred was wearing the t-shirt at the time of death. Who fired the shot? At whom? Or at what? Was the t-shirt on one of them at the time of the shot and removed later? Or was it hanging in the hut and hit by accident? There were no answers. This is where the first serious discrepancy between the sources arose. Some claimed that the bullet holes were inside the hut, in the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Others, citing the words of Robert himself, said that the shots were fired outwards, into the trees surrounding the hut, and that the spent cartridges lay on the ground outside. The difference is significant. Shooting inside an enclosed space could indicate panic, a struggle, or an attempt at defense. Shooting outwards into the trees is more like an attempt to scare off something approaching from the woods. In both cases, the question remained the same. If David and Fred fired their guns to defend themselves against a threat, what was that threat? And why, after firing their shots, did they lock all the guns inside the hut and flee into the taiga unarmed? There was one more detail that didn't fit into any of the usual patterns. The burns on David's hands and forearms. The official postmortem noted them, but did not explain their origin. The fires around the perimeter of the hut were small and had been lit on the ground. You could burn yourself on such a fire if you fell into it, or tried to put it out with your hands. But the burns were only on his hands and forearms, not on his face, legs, or torso. It looked as though David had grabbed something burning or shielded himself from the fire with his hands. And yet, he was found 4 kilometers from the hut. If he had burned himself by the fire, why didn't he go back inside, where there was water, a first aid kit, and warmth? What made him, with his hands badly burned, walk away from the shelter, deep into the impenetrable undergrowth, until the cold killed him? Fred, for his part, was found in the river 20 kilometers further downstream, drowning in the Nahanni in June, where the water is freezing even in summer, can happen quickly. Hypothermia causes the muscles to seize up, and the current does the rest. But that assumes Fred entered the water for some reason, whether voluntarily or by force. Why would an experienced hunter venture into an icy river in June without a life jacket, without a boat? At night, 2 people. One ran into the woods and froze to death. The other ran to the river and drowned. Both had fled from the same place, a locked hut with weapons, food, and warmth. Both ran in different directions. Both died. The RCMP inspected the cabin and sent both bodies for post-mortem examination to Edmonton, the capital of Alberta, 1,500 kilometers to the south. The bodies were transported by plane. The findings were succinct: hypothermia and drowning. A criminal cause was ruled out. Tests for drugs and alcohol were negative. No signs of violent death were found. The case was not classified as a murder. The phrase "criminal activity ruled out" meant that, in the investigators' view, both men had died of natural causes. Hypothermia and drowning do, indeed, not require anyone's involvement. But this wording did not explain the circumstances that led to the hypothermia and drowning. It stated the outcome, but not the cause. It was as if a report on a plane crash had stated that the plane had crashed, but had not explained why it had crashed. As far as the police were concerned, the case was effectively closed. The active phase of the search had already been scaled back on 23rd of June, even before the first body was found. The deployment of a police dog on July 5th seemed more of a symbolic gesture than a full-scale operation. Following the discovery of Fred's body on July 8th, the investigation was concluded. For the families, the story was only just beginning. David's sister, Rosemary Gill, spoke for all the relatives. How could 2 men both die in a single weekend, one in the river and the other in the woods? She added that it was a source of constant distress and that there was no closure to the matter. David's stepbrother, Joseph Horesai, collected the coroner's reports and took them to the RCMP station in Yellowknife. He wanted the case to be reinvestigated. The families lodged a complaint about the police's conduct back in 2005. The RCMP conducted an internal review and found no misconduct on their part. Despite repeated requests, the police have never confirmed whether the case has been reopened. Jonas Antoine, the very same member of the search party who was the first to notice the burns on David's hands, later said that there were still far too many unanswered questions surrounding the case. He knew both men personally. He knew what they were capable of in the woods. And that is precisely why he could not accept the theory that 2 highly experienced hunters had abandoned their weapons and food, locked the cabin, and walked away to die. Officially, The causes of death had been established. Unofficially, nothing had been explained. No fires, no bullet holes, no locked-away weapons, no burns, and no bodies in places where they hadn't been before. The pathologist's report described what David and Fred had died of. It did not describe why. The case remained formally closed and effectively unsolved. In one of those places where unsolved cases had been piling up for over 100 years, when the official investigation concluded but questions remained, the void was filled with theories. These were put forward by relatives, journalists, internet forum users, documentary podcasters, and ordinary people who simply couldn't let the story go. Each theory explained some of the facts, but none of them explained everything. The official position of the RCMP and the pathologist was that both men had died of natural causes without any criminal involvement. David died of hypothermia. Fred drowned. Tests for drugs and alcohol came back negative. No signs of violence were found on the bodies. This version was based on the results of the post-mortem examination carried out at a certified laboratory in Edmonton. And, in a purely medical sense, it was flawless. The bodies did indeed show what they showed. One man froze to death, the other drowned. But everything else remained outside the scope of the medical report. The shooting in the cabin, the fires around the perimeter, the locked-away weapons, the burns, the flight of two experienced men into the night forest, empty-handed. The official version described the cause of death, but did not address what had led to it. One of the most widely discussed theories was that of an attack by a wild animal. Nahanni National Park is home to grizzly bears, black bears, wolves, and wolverines. For a hunter from Fort Simpson, an encounter with any of these predators would not have been out of the ordinary. According to this theory, a bear might have approached the hut, drawn by the smell of food. The campfires around the perimeter fitted this picture. They are lit precisely to scare off predators. The gunfire could also have been an attempt to frighten the animal with the sound of shots. Supporters of this theory pointed out that bears in the Northwest Territories, particularly grizzlies, are capable of showing great persistence, returning to the source of the scent time and time again. The animal might have prowled around the hut for hours, ignoring both the fire and the gunshots, and at some point the hunters might have panicked and fled. Several facts immediately contradicted this theory. No signs of an animal attack were found on David and Fred's bodies. No bites, no scratches, no lacerations. A bear that is chasing a human leaves traces. Moreover, experienced hunters know that it is impossible to outrun a bear. A grizzly can reach speeds of up to 50 kilometers per hour, and fleeing provokes the predator to give chase. Standard tactics when encountering a bear involve taking shelter in an enclosed space, making noise, and, as a last resort, using a weapon. This is precisely what David and Fred, it seems, were doing, lighting fires and firing shots. And then they abandoned the fires, the weapons, and the hut, and ran. This was the exact opposite of everything that survival experience in bear country teaches. Another theory suggested a conflict between the hunters themselves. According to this scenario, David and Fred may have had an argument that escalated into a fight. One of them may have locked the other out, which would explain the locked door. Both ended up in the woods and died separately. This version was the least plausible. Everyone who knew both men described them as inseparable friends, so close that it was almost impossible to imagine them in open conflict with one another. There were no signs of a struggle on the bodies, no bruises, no grazes, no defensive wounds on their hands. Furthermore, if one had locked the other out, that would explain why one fled. But it did not explain why the other had also left the hut, leaving everything inside. One theory attempted to link David's burns to Fred's drowning as part of a single chain of events. According to this account, David may have accidentally burned himself at one of the perimeter campfires. Having suffered burns, he rushed to the river to cool his wounds in the water. The current swept him away, and he began to drown. Fred jumped in after his friend to pull him out, but he himself could not cope with the icy water and drowned. David managed to get ashore, but in his wet clothes, at night, and without shelter, he froze to death 4 kilometers from the hut. The theory seemed plausible at first glance, but upon closer inspection it fell apart. The bonfires had been lit all around the perimeter of the hut, not by the water. The river was some distance from the line of fires. If David had been burned, it would have been easier for him to return to the hut, where there was a first aid kit and water, than to run to the river. And this theory did nothing to explain the bullet holes in the hut, the t-shirt riddled with bullets, or the fact that the weapon had been left inside, behind a locked door. One theory was put forward by those who had noticed the bullet holes and the t-shirt riddled with bullet holes. According to this theory, the cabin may have been attacked by intruders. Armed assailants might have forced David and Fred to flee the cabin, after which the hunters perished in the taiga from the cold and water. In this scenario, the gunfire and the fires around the perimeter were part of a defensive measure, not an attack. What spoke in favor of this theory was that it explained the main paradox: why 2 experienced men had dropped everything and fled. If they had been forced out, they would have had no choice. What worked against the theory was the complete lack of evidence pointing to the presence of third parties. The police found no traces of other people around the cabin. The post-mortem revealed no signs of a violent death. Within a radius of 125 kilometers of the hut, there were no settlements, no camps, and no roads. The only way to reach the place was by air or by water, and no one had reported seeing any strangers. The RCMP considered the possibility of foul play in the early stages of the investigation, but ruled it out. However, critics have pointed out that the active phase of the police investigation lasted only 5 days, and that during this time the forensic analysis of the scene may not have been carried out thoroughly enough. Another hypothesis relating to an altered state of consciousness has been discussed on forums and in podcasts. According to this theory, David and Fred may have been exposed to something that caused them to hallucinate or suffer a severe panic attack. The shooting at the cabin and at the trees may not have been aimed at a real animal or a real person, but at a non-existent threat. Their flight into the woods without weapons or supplies was explained by the fact that, in a state of acute psychosis or panic disorder, a person acts irrationally. Supporters of this theory pointed to rabies as a possible cause. A bite from an infected animal, such as a bat, might have gone unnoticed, and the incubation period for rabies ranges from several weeks to several months. Symptoms include aggression, confusion, hallucinations, and hydrophobia. This theory was contradicted by the toxicology results, although standard screening does not include testing for rabies. The incubation period for rabies is usually considerably longer than 4 days, which means that symptoms would have had to appear before the trip. None of their relatives had noticed any signs of illness or erratic behavior in David or Fred prior to their departure. Furthermore, rabies usually affects a single person, and the simultaneous acute onset in 2 individuals would be an extremely rare occurrence. Another version of this theory suggested a poisoning, carbon monoxide from a faulty stove, or spores from a poisonous mushroom. But the hut was well ventilated, and the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning usually include loss of consciousness, not a frantic dash for miles. Finally, there was a theory that could neither be proven nor disproven, and which drew its strength not so much from the facts of the case as from the reputation of the place itself. For over a century, the Nahanni Valley had been gathering tales of people meeting equally strange deaths: decapitated bodies, burnt-out huts, abandoned weapons, fleeing into the forest, missing gold. Each new incident added a layer to the legend, and the legend in turn colored each new incident. The Dene people knew of this place long before the gold prospectors. Their legends spoke of the Naha mountain tribe, which vanished without a trace, of evil spirits dwelling in the gorges, of a giant creature that some called Vahila, others Nakani. Modern authors and bloggers have picked up on these images, turning the valley into one of the world's most famous, cursed landscapes. Those who favored a supernatural explanation pointed to a pattern: too many deaths over too long a period, circumstances that were all too similar, and too few answers. They saw David and Fred's deaths as the continuation of a centuries-old chain in which the valley claimed those who entered it. Everything that works against any supernatural hypothesis also worked against this version. A complete lack of scientific evidence and the findings of forensic pathologists, which established specific, entirely mundane causes of death. But one observation remained true. In over 100 years, there had not been a single instance in the Nahanni Valley where all the circumstances surrounding a person's death had been fully explained. Time passed, and the case of Horesi and Hardisty faded from view. The police had no grounds to reopen the investigation. The families lacked the resources to conduct their own. Gunderson's cabin stood on the banks of the North Nahanni, just as it had always been. No one had demolished it. No one had fenced it off. The forest around it continued to grow, obscuring the paths and tracks. The thicket where David's body had been found had become even denser. The river carried its waters to the Liard, and from there to the Mackenzie, and on to the Arctic Ocean. The place where the tragedy had occurred bore no visible traces. The taiga forgets faster than people do. In Fort Simpson, David and Fred were remembered. In a village of 1,000 people, 2 deaths are not forgotten. But remembering and knowing what happened are 2 different things. The families lived with a sense of unresolved grief that did not fade with the passing years. Rosemary Gill, David's sister, kept asking the same question that no one could answer. How could 2 men have died in a single weekend? One in the woods, the other in the river. Both separately, both in places where they had already been searched for. The case did not become a cold case in the police sense of the term. As far as the RCMP were concerned, it had been closed and the cause of death established. But for everyone else, it remained precisely what the police usually refer to as an unsolved case. A case where the outcome is known, but the cause remains unknown. 13 years later, in 2018, the families made another attempt. Joseph Horesi, David's half-brother, went to the RCMP station in Yellowknife with the coroner's reports and demanded a review of the case. He said that the police had let their families down and prayed that something would finally come of this story. Robert Hardisty, Fred's brother, the very same man who had visited the cabin and seen the bullet holes, backed him up. By that point, Robert had spent 13 years convinced that there was more to the story than the official version suggested. His words to the effect that the picture of what had happened was broader than simply 2 men who had died from the cold. And water had by then become the most famous phrase in the case. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, published a report on Joseph's visit, and the story briefly returned to the headlines. The RCMP has yet to confirm whether the case has been reopened. Despite repeated requests from journalists, the force has not provided a definitive answer. The families lodged a complaint about the police's handling of the case back in 2005, immediately after David and Fred's deaths. At the time, the RCMP conducted an internal review and concluded that no breaches had occurred during the investigation. 13 years on, the response remains essentially the same. Meanwhile, the story was unfolding elsewhere. On Reddit, in the section dedicated to unsolved cases, The Horesi and Hardesti case was discussed at length. Users analyzed every detail: the direction of the bullet holes, the logic of the escape, the nature of the burns, the dog's behavior, and the distances between the hut and the locations where the bodies were found. New theories emerged. Old ones were refined. Some referred to the words of relatives, whilst others drew parallels with other cases in the valley. YouTube channels picked up on the story. Mr. Balin, one of the largest English-language channels dedicated to mysterious disappearances, included the case in an episode on Nahani. The Red Web podcast examined the case in a separate episode. The Exploring with Wade channel dedicated a series of videos to the valley. Each new retelling added to the audience, but added no facts. The story became overgrown with interpretations, and each interpretation reflected not so much the reality of what had happened as what the narrator wanted to believe. For cryptozoology, blogs and fans of the paranormal, the deaths of David and Fred served as modern-day confirmation of old legends. Decapitated gold prospectors from the turn of the century, the vanished Naha tribe, evil spirits in the gorges, the giant wolf Wahila, and now, 100 years later, 2 hunters from indigenous peoples, who knew this land better than anyone, have perished in circumstances that neither the police nor science can explain. For these authors, the circle was complete. For families, nothing fell into place. Nahani National Park continues to welcome between 800 and 1,000 visitors a year. Most of them arrive by seaplane, go rafting down the South Nahani, and take photographs of Virginia Falls and the canyons, which National Geographic has ranked among the world's top 20 adventures. The Visitor Center in Fort Simpson features an exhibition dedicated to the history, culture, and geography of the region. The valley remains a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the last truly wild landscapes on the planet. The place names, however, remained unchanged: Valley of the Dead, Headless Creek, Funeral Ridge. They still appear on maps marking specific spots where specific people died or went missing. 20 people lost their lives searching for the McLeod's lost gold vein. The vein itself was never found. David Horesi and Frederick Hardesty are not officially listed among the valley's unsolved mysteries. Their case has been closed. The causes of death have been established: hypothermia, drowning. But in the cabin on the banks of the North Nahani, 125 kilometers from Fort Simpson, there remain bullet holes that no one has been able to explain. There remain traces of fires lit by people who knew what they were doing, and yet still fled. Weapons remain behind a locked door. And there remains a question that haunts their families, one to which no one has yet provided an answer. What happened in the hut between 12th and 16th June 2005? Geologist Frank Henderson, who lost his partner in this valley in 1946, once said, "It is quite impossible to deny the eerie atmosphere of this whole valley. I shall not soon forget the strange, incessant howling of the wind." The wind in the Nahani Valley has not stopped since then.